Hi. This is the lecture for week 3. And this week, excuse me, this week we're looking at 3 essays, Joan Didion, June Jordan, and Alice Walker. And you can see where we've really got a time period jump this week. So we're going to um, take a minute to kind of, I'll say, honor movement from past to more present. So what we're looking at with Didion and Jordan is writing in the late 60s, and what we're looking at in Walker is more like the 70s and on. I think it's important for us to, in this, kind of do a compare contrast and think about if we're taking 100 years, give or take, between the times these women were writing, how does that change the voice or not? And I was noting in your discussion boards for week 1 that many of you were kind of taking a minute to remark upon, the kind of contradictory feel of how far we've come and not, let's say, in social justice broadly, but also in women's issues. So recognizing that certainly when Elizabeth Cady Stanton was writing, certainly when Sojourner Truth was writing, the limitations on women and certainly issues related to race and class were so much more egregious. And now we still find ourselves in this struggle. We see it around us every day in the news, but by the same token, when we pause to reflect, we also say in many ways we've come farther. We've taken steps towards being in a better place, a place of social justice and equality. So how is that reflected in the writing, right? So in one sense, we can just look in terms of message and we can say, what are each of them talking about? And I think as we find each group of women reflecting upon their experiences and what it means to write their lives, we're going to see a lot of the same themes. We're going to see the same struggles regarding what a woman's role is in society, how she is treated and perceived, especially by others. So a lot of women's writing, you'll notice, is really about that perception of the other towards women. And what does that mean for a human being? Simply to have to kind of reside and exist, I'll say, almost in a mirror or as a reflection of others, and not to have, as we say, that agency of self-determination to say, this is who and how I am in the world, but to constantly have to be up against residing only as a reflection of the way other people perceive you. And I think that that's a lot of what injustice is. It removes that sense of self-determination and agency in people finding their identities. And certainly June Jordan addresses that in Report from the Bahamas. And if you take a look in Alice Walker's essay, it really is about that struggle for identity, and not just who I am, but how is that in relation to how others see me versus how I see myself, and making peace with myself. So I would like you to think about that. Again, I want you to think about kind of what's the similarities and differences in terms of what these women are saying, from the earlier writings to the more modern writings in terms of message. How are the messages the same? How are they different? And you're going to find there's a little bit of difference in language too, because certainly the earlier women's writing reflects a different use of language than the modern era. So the modern era is a little bit more what we're used to, and there's a sense of formality to some degree. If you look at Elizabeth Cady Stanton's writing, a sense of formality in that. But again, so if we start to think about some of our course themes regarding agency, resistance, women's bodies, silence, I'd like to continue that discussion now. So the Joan Didion essay, we'll take it from the top, Marrying Absurd, is a short piece. So in some sense, it's, the writing is pretty straightforward. And she's really just taking this snapshot of the whole Vegas marriage phenomenon, especially if we contextualize this to the late 60s, and what she was looking at in terms of the political climate with getting out of the draft and things like that, and how all of a sudden there was this resurgence in, all these young people getting married, for the men not to have to go to war. So she's really kind of taking this slice of life snapshot here. But I think whenever a woman writes about marriage, I think that becomes a discussion of equality, and it becomes a discussion of how women are perceived and treated, and opportunities that women have in society. So I would like you to use the Didion essay as a moment simply to kind of reflect on that contextually. Take it as a snapshot of the modern era, and what that might mean in terms of how far women had come at that point, or not, as the case may be. And what do you think Didion's message was in that? And how is that coming through some of the setting that she was describing? And when we talk about short stories in a few weeks, we're going to look more at writing strategies related to genre and how that enhances meaning and message. So for Didion, we'll just use that as a little practice ground, and you can take a look at her descriptions and how her use of image around Vegas and what she chooses to bring up and describe around the Strip and the natural setting of Vegas, and kind of this portrayal of the chapels and the process of the marriage and what happens. How does her description communicate her message? And certainly I think we can get that idea of agency when we're thinking about women, and there's that one voice in the end of that young bride. So I'd like you to pay careful attention to that, and how Didion brings in that one bride at the end. What does that young woman say, and what do you think the impact is in Didion leaving us with that message? If we move to Alice Walker, When the Other Dancer is the Self, this was a longer piece, and certainly very, very rich for reflection around women's issues, especially when it comes to women's bodies. So we have in this essay really Walker taking us through what it means for us to think about ourselves and our value. And she has this contradiction. So if we think about resistance, and we think about resistance as tension, okay, she's got this contradiction of how she saw herself at one point in her life, and then after the accident with her eye, how she saw herself after that, how other people saw her, and then her coming to terms with all of that, really through a lifetime of work. So we have, for Walker, we have so many of our themes evidenced in this essay. We have that idea of resistance or tension with how she views herself versus other in time period, and how others view her. We have women's bodies, and we also have transition and transformation, how she comes and goes in and out of her identity, and how she begins to see herself as beautiful in different ways, and redefine beauty. But what I would also like you to think about strongly for Walker, for Jordan, certainly, but for Walker is the voice. And I'm going to call it that, the inner voice versus the outer voice. What I'd like you to start to think about through these memoirs and these personal essays, and even when we go into reading our poetry and our short stories, I would like you to think about in women's writing, and again, what it means for women to write their lives, how the narrator's voice or the speaker's voice that's coming through the writing has an inner world, right? What the speaker is thinking, and then how does that relate to what the speaker or the narrator actually says or does? So we all kind of have that inner voice. And I just think it's really interesting for women to kind of reflect upon this as an issue of equality and justice versus, what's going on in our heads versus what we really say to people. So what I would like you to think about, especially in Walker and especially in Jordan, is what is that tension or resistance with the inner voice and the outer voice of the speaker. And I would also certainly relate this to this idea of silence. Silence was something that I had brought up in the first week. And not just thinking about how women in society are silenced, but how we silence ourselves. what we say versus what we don't say. And I would like you to think about this in the writings, and how is that idea of silence related to the inner voice, right, versus the outer voice of these women. And what message is that in the writing?